Picture this. 10,000 years before the pyramids, on the marshy edge of a lake in what is now northern Kenya, a group of people are ambushed. Some are killed instantly, but others are not so lucky. Their wrists show signs of binding. They didn't die fighting, they died as prisoners. This isn't fiction. It's a real archaeological site called Nataruk, uncovered by researcher Marta Mirazan-Lar. It's considered one of the earliest direct pieces of evidence for organized violence between prehistoric groups. And buried inside that violence is something even more unsettling. Proof that our ancestors didn't just kill their enemies. Sometimes, they kept them. We love to imagine prehistoric humans as simple survivors, just hunting, gathering, and huddling around fires. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more they uncover a far darker social reality, one built on raids, captives, and forced belonging. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some scientists believe captivity might have shaped human evolution itself. Let's start with the obvious question. Why would a small hunter-gatherer band, struggling to feed itself, want a prisoner? Wouldn't an extra mouth just be a burden? Here's the twist. In small populations, people are the most valuable resource there is. Anthropologist Lawrence Keeley, one of the leading voices on prehistoric warfare, has argued that raiding for people, not land, not food, was one of the most common motives for violence among early human groups. Women were taken to become wives, boosting the reproductive strength of a struggling band. Children were taken and raised as replacement kin, especially in groups devastated by disease or war. And able-bodied adults were taken simply to work, to haul, to hunt, to process animal skins, to do the exhausting, invisible labor that kept a Stone Age community alive. But here's where it gets even stranger. This wasn't just theory. Scientists have found the biological fingerprints of it. At a Bronze Age site in Germany, researcher Douglas Price used strontium isotope analysis, a technique that reads the chemical signature of the water and soil you grew up drinking and eating from, locked permanently into your teeth. What he found was startling. Several women buried at local settlements had isotope signatures completely foreign to the region. They hadn't grown up there, they'd come from somewhere else entirely, and never left again. Now, stretch that idea back further, into the deeper Stone Age, tens of thousands of years earlier. If groups were already practicing this kind of movement of people across territories in the Bronze Age, how far back does the pattern go? Some researchers believe it goes back to the very origins of Homo sapiens, and possibly even further, into the shadowy overlap between us and the Neanderthals. Here's a detail that rarely makes headlines. When scientists sequenced ancient Neanderthal genomes, they found something almost impossible to explain through simple migration alone. Repeated, small pulses of interbreeding with early Homo sapiens over thousands of years across different regions. Some geneticists suggest this pattern is consistent not just with peaceful encounters, but with something colder, the absorption of individuals from one group into another, whether by choice or by force. We may never know exactly what happened in those meetings in the fog of the Ice Age, but the DNA inside you right now might be a quiet witness to it. Now imagine you're the one taken. What would that life actually look like? Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains have found something chilling. Healed fractures on wrist and ankle bones, patterns consistent with prolonged binding. Not the kind you get from an accident, but from repeated restraint over months or years. Picture waking up every day tied at the wrists, forced to grind grain, carry water, or nurse a stranger's child, surrounded by people who speak a different tongue, follow different rituals, and worship different spirits than the ones you grew up with. Your old identity doesn't just disappear, it's erased, piece by piece, until the only life left is the one your captors allow you to have. And yet, and this is the part that upends everything, many of these captives weren't kept as outsiders forever. Anthropological studies of surviving hunter-gatherer societies, like the work done among certain Amazonian and Aboriginal Australian groups, show that captives, especially children, were often eventually absorbed completely into the group. They married in. Their children were raised as full members. Within a generation or two, the descendants of a stolen child could become chiefs, spiritual leaders, or the ancestors of the very group that took them. Which means captivity in prehistory wasn't only a story of violence, It was, disturbingly, one of the engines of human connection. The brutal, uninvited way that isolated bands of hunter-gatherers were forced to mix their blood, their languages, and their cultures. Without raiding, without capture, some anthropologists argue, we might still be a species of small, closed-off, inbred tribal islands, technologically stagnant, genetically narrow. The very same brutality that shattered individual lives may have been quietly stitching the human species together. So here's the perspective shift. When you look at a skeleton in a museum case, bones yellowed with age, it's tempting to see just a relic, a fact, a data point, a line in a textbook. But somewhere behind those bones was a person who was hunted down, dragged from everyone they had ever loved, and forced to survive inside someone else's world. And extraordinarily, some of them didn't just survive. They rebuilt. They had children. Their bloodline continued. Inside people who, generations later, had no idea where they truly came from. Which means that somewhere in your own ancestry, however many thousands of years back, there may be someone who was taken. Someone who lived through the single most brutal experience a prehistoric human could face. And instead of ending a story, became the beginning of one. That's not just history. That's the raw, uncomfortable machinery of how humanity was built.